Welcome back to Sip&Talk. This is EP442.
Great to be back.
So we've been getting some messages, actually, from listeners over in Taiwan. They're asking if we've noticed certain political parties starting to sound, well, maybe a bit too much like their neighbor.
Huh. You mean like the fake smiles and maybe slightly too aggressive handshakes you sometimes see on the streets in Taipei or something else?
No, not quite that. I'm talking about the Kuomintang, the KMT. We were looking at those recent interviews by their representative, Cheng Li-wen.
Oh, right. Those made some waves.
Yeah. I mean, saying Putin isn't a dictator, insisting everyone is Chinese, the whole picture. It honestly felt like someone just streamed Beijing's political textbook live in Taiwan.
That's putting it bluntly.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sounds less like, pro-China in a general sense and maybe more like, well, like a Communist Party branch performing openly for the world stage.
It's exactly my thought. It feels like the KMT's current position isn't really about, the old taking back the mainland anymore. It's shifted to telling everyone, just don't make China unhappy, and then trying really hard to make that sound completely normal.
And that's where the real problem kicks in, right? Because when concepts like not wanting to be ruled by them or just maintaining the status quo or even defending yourself, when all of that gets defined on the other side as Taiwan independence.
They basically seize the entire narrative. They control the terms of the debate.
Precisely.
So today we're going to try and break down this kind of rhetoric. We want to look at how the KMT seems to be turning, factual realities into perceived crimes, and explore why this leaning towards Beijing could be seen as, well, essentially self-sabotage. Sorry if that term sounds a little sharp.
No, I actually think it fits. Unfortunately, even the sharpest language we might use here probably doesn't cut as deep as some of the, frankly, malicious labels the Communist Party throws at Taiwan. And importantly, we also want to equip you, the listener, with some ways to think about countering this, how to maybe reclaim the truth, or at least the narrative, for the Taiwanese people.
Okay, so our focus for this Sip and Talk is pretty clear. We're tracing the KMT's ideological journey, from a party once defined by counterattack to one now openly embracing pro-China and, well, even pro-Russia rhetoric, it seems.
It's a significant shift, and understanding it is pretty crucial for grasping the dynamics over there.
Let's start with maybe the most visible evidence of this transformation. You mentioned Cheng Li-wen's interviews.
Yeah, those interviews, especially with outlets like DW or Focus Taiwan, felt like a real turning point. If there ever was a kind of polite facade the KMT maintained for the international community, well, those interviews seemed to be the moment it just completely evaporated.
It's interesting because before this, you think about leaders like Ma Ying-jeou or Eric Chu. They were generally quite careful, weren't they?
Very careful, put on the suit, speak calmly, project that image of an internationally aware, almost Western-style conservative party, whatever they might have been saying domestically. Internationally, there was always this layer of diplomacy.
But Cheng Li-wen, it seemed like she just decided to throw that whole playbook out the window.
It really did seem that way. And the shock factor, I think, starts with her pretty open alignment with what some call the authoritarian axis. She stated, quite plainly, that she doesn't consider Vladimir Putin a dictator.
Okay, wait. Her reason was?
Because, in her words, he was elected by Russia's people.
Right. Okay, so unpack that for us. What's the significance of a major political figure in a functioning democracy like Taiwan adopting that specific talking point?
Well, it's significant because it's essentially adopting the core logic of the authoritarian playbook. It's the same kind of justification Beijing uses for its own system, this idea of Chinese-style democracy.
And the flaw in that logic is?
The premise is just fundamentally flawed, isn't it? The idea that simply holding some kind of vote, regardless of whether you suppress all the opposition, control the media entirely, or, jail your main challengers, that somehow grants legitimacy.
So it's not really just a stance on Russia. It's more like an alignment of fundamental political values.
Exactly. I mean, look at what happened with Alexei Navalny. When you eliminate all serious challengers and then run virtually unopposed or in these highly managed scenarios, that isn't democracy. It's political theater designed purely to maintain a dictatorship.
So by denying Putin as a dictator based on that election?
The KMT, through her, is implicitly signaling that they view power secured through the elimination of dissent as potentially legitimate. That's the basic logic of authoritarian rule, and now it's being presented openly as part of the KMT's international platform. It's quite a statement.
And this consistency, as the analysis points out, it didn't stop with Putin. It extended directly to how she talked about the Ukraine war.
Yes, she explicitly blamed the conflict on NATO's repeated eastward expansion. Now, we see analysts noting this is basically a direct, almost word-for-word copy of the talking points used consistently by both Russian state media and the CCP's foreign ministry.
Wow, word for word. That's a heavy claim.
Yeah.
What does adopting that specific narrative actually do for the KMT politically?
Well, it seems to achieve a couple of goals. First, obviously, it shifts the moral blame completely away from the aggressor, Russia, and puts it onto the victims and the defensive alliance, NATO, which is, quite a twist.
And the second goal, more relevant to Beijing, perhaps.
Exactly. More critically for Beijing's interests, it adopts the principle that defensive alliances themselves are somehow inherently provocative. See the logic? If the KMT can help normalize the idea that seeking allies or just boosting your own defense is somehow aggressive, then they can justify their own policy of minimizing Taiwan's self-defense to avoid provoking Beijing.
Which brings us neatly to defense spending. Let's look at her position against boosting Taiwan's defense budget to 5% of GDP. That's been a pretty key debate in Taiwan.
It has. And her main justification for opposing that 5% target was, interestingly, a comparison to Europe. She argued that, quote, neither Germany nor NATO would be willing to increase their defense budgets to 5%.
Okay, and the analysis calls this argument
Fundamentally contradictory. I mean, Taiwan is facing an immediate, you could say, existential threat just 100 miles across the strait. Germany, despite recent changes after the Ukraine invasion, isn't facing that kind of imminent invasion scenario.
It's comparing apples and, well, highly explosive oranges, maybe. So why is this argument seen as so damaging?
Because it aligns perfectly with what's understood to be the CCP's core strategic objective regarding Taiwan. Beijing's goal is simple. They want Taiwan's defense budget to be as low as possible, preferably zero, right?
Makes sense from their perspective.
Of course. Every dollar Taiwan doesn't spend on its own defense is a dollar. Beijing doesn't have to worry about overcoming if things turn kinetic. So when a major domestic opposition party actively fights against defense spending increases, they effectively become an unpaid agent working towards the external threat's objective.
And the reporter interviewing her didn't just let that comparison stand, did they? They pressed her for an alternative figure.
They did. They asked basically, okay, if 5% is too high, what number is necessary for Taiwan's defense? And according to the reports, she could not provide a number.
What does that imply?
Well, it strongly implies that the policy priority isn't really about fiscal responsibility or finding the optimal defense spending level. The priority seems to be simply not provoking China by spending too much on security. Defense spending is viewed almost as a political liability to be minimized rather than a critical national imperative.
Now, beyond the specific talking points, the reports also highlighted a pretty striking shift in her personal demeanor during these interviews. Foreign media apparently picked up on this immediately. We used to talk about diplomats. What did they observe in Cheng Li-1?
Yeah, this was quite stark. She was described using terms like displaying roughness and hostility, staring like a fighting cock, demonstrating arrogant, rude actions, and even using contemptuous laughter.
Oh.
And this is where that phrase, wolf warrior similarity, comes into play. We should probably define that clearly for listeners who might not be familiar.
Yeah, let's define wolf warrior diplomacy.
Okay, so the wolf warrior approach, which really got popularized by some aggressive diplomats from Beijing in recent years, it's characterized by a few key things. First, there's this public rejection of objective facts. Telling reporters their facts are simply wrong, while asserting yours are correct, usually without providing much evidence.
Okay, denial of facts.
What else? Second, it involves engaging in really aggressive personal attacks and a lot of rhetorical bluster, rather than actually engaging with the substance of the issue. It's all designed to project strength and deny any perceived weakness through sheer volume and, frankly, hostility.
And Cheng Li-1's style mirrored this.
According to the observers, yes. Her style denying facts, showing open hostility, closely mirrored this official CCP diplomatic conduct. And that revealed something new, a consistent pro-CCP style that operates the same way both domestically inside Taiwan and internationally. The polite diplomatic pretense seems to have just gone, replaced by belligerence. The death of the true KMT and ideological transformation. And it's important to understand, this shift we're seeing with figures like Cheng Li-1, it isn't just some random accident or simply bad behavior by one individual politician. It's arguably the inevitable result of a decades-long collapse and transformation of the KMT's core historical identity.
We do hear that term, true KMT, thrown around sometimes. For listeners who might be newer to Taiwan politics, can you sketch out what exactly that true KMT spirit really was?
Sure. The true KMT historically speaking, is really defined by the era of Chiang Kai-shek and his son, Chiang Ching-kuo. Its core identity, its entire reason for existing on Taiwan after 1949, was this fiercely anti-communist crusade.
Right, the whole recovering the mainland idea.
Exactly. They were dedicated politically and crucially militarily to recovering the mainland using the three principles of the people. They viewed the CCP not as a legitimate government over in China, but as a temporary, illegitimate rebel group that needed to be suppressed.
And this wasn't just talk, right? This was backed by serious, massive military planning.
Oh, absolutely. Think about something like Project Kwang Kwang, which was launched way back in 1961. This was a monumental, top-secret military operation. It involved things like training specialized commando units, maintaining sophisticated intelligence networks inside the mainland, and preparing incredibly detailed invasion plans, all aimed at eventually recovering the mainland.
So the entire military structure of the ROC back then was fundamentally geared towards that one single objective.
That was its purpose. That fierce anti-communist soul, that drive to retake the mainland that defined the party.
Okay. And the analysis we looked at tracks the death of that soul, you could say, through three distinct critical historical stages. Let's start with the first one, the fading, or maybe the failure, of the actual counterattack plan.
Right. Stage one really began to unfold in the early 1970s, and it was largely driven by just harsh international reality. The most crushing blow, undeniably, was the ROC losing its United Nations seat to the People's Republic of China in 1971.
That was a huge symbolic moment.
Massive. That was the moment the world essentially signaled it no longer viewed the ROC government in Taipei as the sole legitimate government of all of China. And militarily, let's be honest, the plan itself is becoming increasingly inviolable against a mainland that now had nuclear weapons.
So the dream was colliding with reality.
Pretty hard. The analysis shows that by 1972, that massive reverse attack plan, the defining goal of the KMT for decades, was officially terminated. The actual military objective was dead.
But they kept the slogan alive for a while.
Yeah, it kind of lingered on as a political slogan, almost like a necessary zombie goal, maybe to maintain morale or some semblance of ideological purity. But the military reality had already moved on. The dream was over, even if the words weren't yet.
Okay, so that's stage one. Stage two is arguably one of the most defining moments for the transformation of Taiwan itself. The shift towards being more Taiwan-centric.
Yeah, this happened primarily under President Lee Teng-hui, spanning the late 1980s and into the early 90s. And the absolute crucial legislative action here was the formal termination of the period of national mobilization for suppression of the Communist Rebellion in 1991.
Okay, we need to pause on that 1991 act. That sounds very official. Why is that specific act so legally and symbolically massive?
Because that act was essentially the formal legislative burial of the KMT's original founding mission. When the ROC government declared the end of the mobilization period, it legally stopped being a government that was actively at war with a domestic rebellion on the mainland.
It was an acknowledgement of reality then.
A tacit acknowledgement, yes, of the political reality of separate rule across the strait. The KMT's focus inevitably had to shift. It moved away from the impossible dream of recovering China toward the very difficult, very complex reality of actually governing Taiwan and managing its ongoing democratic transition. That act officially dismantled the old anti-communist core of the party's mission.
Okay, so we've gone from the fierce anti-communist KMT in stage one to the more Taiwan-focused KMT in stage two. That leads us directly to stage three, the shift from maybe reconciliation to what the analysis calls pro-China agency.
And this stage really accelerated rapidly in the 2000s after the KMT lost power for the first time. They needed a new rallying cry, a new purpose, and economic interest provided the fuel. The party's primary political objective did a complete flip. It moved from being fundamentally anti-communist to making anti-Taiwan independence its core political mission.
Whoa, hold on. That's a huge distinction. They basically replaced their historical archenemy, the CCP, with Taiwan's own democratic identity as the primary threat to oppose.
That's how it appears, yes. And that transition was very heavily driven by economic links. Specifically, the big push for agreements like the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, or ECFA. Cross-strait business interests became a primary political driver, cementing this idea that Taiwan's stability and prosperity depend almost solely on keeping Beijing happy.
And the rhetoric we hear from figures inside the KMT today seems to reflect this pretty profound reversal.
Oh, absolutely. You look at someone like legislator Chen Yu-chen, who publicly stated that Taiwan is originally part of China. Unification is the ultimate goal. Now think about that. That's quite aggressive. It's basically abandoning the ROC's own historical claim of governing all of China and instead adopting the PRC's territorial claim on Taiwan as the goal.
That actually sounds even more blunt than Beijing's typical official line, which often uses softer phrasing like reunification is an inevitable historical trend rather than just ultimate goal.
It demonstrates alignment pretty unambiguously. Then you have figures like the former vice chairman, Lien Shengwen, criticizing U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. He called them merely profiting from the Taiwanese people's hard-earned money.
Which completely ignores the actual defense need, right?
It ignores the defense requirement and just parrots the CCP narrative that any foreign military support for Taiwan is purely opportunistic or meant to provoke.
And perhaps the most stunning example, reflecting that internal democratic erosion we'll talk more about later, is the praise for Beijing's political system itself.
Yeah, the sources noted this one specifically. Su Chenwei, who is the wife of a very key KMT official, Fu Kunchi, openly praised the CCP's concept of all-process people's democracy by suggesting that Taiwan should study Beijing's model, while she's directly undermining the value, maybe even the necessity of Taiwan's own, world-class democratic institutions.
So when you put those pieces together, the explicit unification goals, the active undermining of defense, the praise for authoritarian governance,
the conclusion drawn by the analysis is pretty inescapable. The KMT has effectively become a cooperator whose current ideological position serves the strategic interests of its former sworn enemy. It's a complete 180. And the analysis uses some pretty sharp language here, like calling this whole ideological reversal self-sabotage or even grave digging for Taiwan, because it carries these massive, potentially existential risks, largely because it seems to ignore the fundamental nature of Beijing's relationship with Taiwan.
And that fundamental nature boils down to conditionality, right?
No
goodwill from Beijing comes without very specific political strings attached.
None whatsoever. That's the key. All of China's economic carrots, the trade benefits, the tourism deals, investment opportunities, they all come with these explicit political red lines. No talk of sovereignty, no recognition of the ROC as a distinct sovereign entity, no pursuit of greater international visibility for Taiwan.
And the moment Taiwan crosses one of those red lines, or even just asserts its existing status too loudly,
the carrots vanish and they turn into sticks. And those sticks are increasingly wielded through economic coercion.
Okay, let's drill down on that a bit. The economic dependency trap.
Yeah.
Our listeners probably know the general concept, but how is it specifically leveraged? Can you give some examples?
Sure. The sources detail how reliance on the mainland market gets weaponized. We've seen really clear examples globally, not just with Taiwan. Look at Lithuania a couple of years ago. When they allowed Taiwan to open a representative office using the name Taiwanese, Beijing retaliated almost instantly.
And it wasn't just blocking Lithuanian goods.
No, it was much more sophisticated. They didn't just target Lithuanian exports directly. They also pressured major international companies, like big German manufacturers, telling them to exclude any Lithuanian components from their supply chains if they wanted to keep selling to China. It wasn't just a tariff. It was a targeted, deep economic wound designed specifically to force Vilnius to change its political stance on Taiwan.
And they did something similar with Australia, too, didn't they? Targeting specific high-value industries.
Precisely. Australian beef, wine, barley key export industries were hit with massive punitive tariffs and even outright bans. And this was widely seen as retaliation for Australia's calls for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19.
So it shows Beijing is perfectly willing to inflict severe, localized economic pain to achieve a political objective.
Exactly. So for Taiwan, becoming excessively reliant on that single market, the mainland market, it's kind of like getting addicted to an economic anesthetic, as one analysis put it. It feels comfortable, maybe even prosperous in the short term, but it renders you completely numb and vulnerable when the political surgery inevitably begins and you find you have absolutely no control over the operating theater anymore.
And this economic dependency then directly compromises Taiwan's ability to actually defend itself.
It's a double whammy, the loss of sovereignty and defense capability. When a major political party like the KMT actively advocates for keeping defense budgets low and prioritizes economic ties over military readiness, well, they are essentially fulfilling Beijing's core strategic goal of minimizing Taiwan's own deterrent capability.
This peace strategy that the KMT often talks about, it's frequently criticized internationally as a strategic misjudgment. Why is it perceived that way, especially by potential allies?
Because it risks alienating the very democratic allies that Taiwan ultimately relies on for its security. Think about it from their perspective. If Taiwan's own political leadership appears unwilling to adequately invest in its own defense, why should allies like the US or Japan, or even partners in NATO, rationally risk their own resources, their own political capital, maybe even their own soldiers' lives, to save a nation whose own leaders seem content to dismantle their defensive posture in exchange for some vague, conditional promise of peace from Beijing?
It suggests a lack of will, a lack of commitment to self-defense.
Exactly. It sends a terrible signal. And the historical parallel that often gets brought up in these analyses is pretty chilling.
The Munich Agreement.
The 1938 Munich Agreement, yes. Appeasement, the idea exchanging your self-defense capabilities for perceived stability, rarely leads to lasting peace. History suggests it often just guarantees a conflict later, usually when the aggressor feels stronger and the defender has become weaker. A peace that's built on the gradual abandonment of your ability to defend yourself isn't really peace, it's just delaying surrender.
And finally, there's this other insidious risk we need to touch on, the risk of internal democratic erosion. This can happen even without a single PLA soldier crossing the Taiwan Strait.
That's maybe the most subtle but also deeply worrying part of this threat. A consistently pro-China policy stance starts to normalize self-censorship within Taiwan's own media, its academia, its political discourse.
How does that work in practice?
Well, when the political and business elite become constantly worried about provoking China or upsetting Beijing, they start to internalize Beijing's red lines. Certain topics become taboo. Debates over sensitive issues, national identity, sovereignty, the necessity of self-defense get stifled, not necessarily by government order, but by this pervasive atmosphere of caution and fear.
So the outward forms of democracy might remain.
The facade of elections, a legislature, a free press might still be there, but the actual soul of democratic freedom, the ability to have robust, critical, sometimes uncomfortable debate gets slowly choked off. The political dialogue becomes hollowed out from within.
Okay, this brings us to what might be the most practical and also maybe the most frustrating part of this whole political landscape. The way language itself is used as a weapon. The analysis we looked at calls the term Taiwan independence, or Taidu in Mandarin, the ultimate weapon in Beijing's cognitive warfare arsenal against Taiwan.
That's exactly right. The term is deliberately designed as a catch-all malicious label. Its sole purpose, really, is to equate any form of resistance to Beijing's demands, any maintenance of democracy, any assertion of a distinct Taiwanese identity with something inherently evil or criminal.
So the CCP gets to establish the definitions first.
They establish the definitions, making it almost impossible for Taiwan to simply exist as it is without being labeled a criminal entity plotting secession.
And crucially, these definitions aren't fixed, are they? They seem to be constantly expanding to trap more and more people, more and more ideas.
Precisely. That's a key tactic. Let's look at how they keep expanding the definitions. The sources highlight 3 key expansions. First, if you simply advocate for maintaining the status quo, which is the current reality, right? De facto independence, the existence of the ROC government, they now label that gradual Taiwan independence.
So just wanting things to stay as they are is now considered a step towards independence.
Yes. You're considered guilty simply for not actively moving towards unification fast enough. Even inaction becomes provocation in their framing.
Okay, what about Taiwan's existing institutions? Its government, its military?
That's the second expansion. The very existence of the ROC, its constitution, its military, its functioning democratic government, is now often labeled substantive Taiwan independence, or sometimes shell independence. They claim the mere existence of a separate, functioning political entity on Taiwan is itself a crime, regardless of what its ultimate stated political aims might be.
And the third expansion relates to Taiwan's interactions with the world.
Exactly. Any attempt by Taiwan to gain international respect, recognition, or simply engage with other countries as a normal democracy that becomes colluding with external forces, this effectively criminalizes normal, routine international engagement that any other country takes for granted.
So the ultimate goal of this relentless, expanding labeling seems twofold.
Yeah. First, to eliminate Taiwan's legitimate international visibility, to isolate it. And second, to create a clear moral justification in advance for any future military action or intense political pressure. They can claim they're simply correcting a crime or stopping separatism.
So how does this language specifically work on the ground? How does it impact the Taiwanese public and the political elite psychologically?
Well, it works primarily through emotional manipulation and inducing fear. First, as we said, they established the crime. Any form of non-submission equals separatism. But the real power, the real bite, comes from the incredibly loaded terminology they use. Phrases like traitor, apangul, or selling out Taiwan, Meitai.
Those are incredibly heavy terms, aren't they? They tap into deep historical anxieties about betrayal and national loyalty.
Exactly. These terms are specifically chosen to induce profound fear and shame. The goal is to encourage massive self-censorship among politicians, among business leaders, even among ordinary citizens. People might choose silence or compliance simply to avoid the horrifying prospect of being publicly branded as a traitor or a separatist.
It creates this internal pressure cooker that limits genuine political debate before the first policy proposal is even put on the table.
That's the idea. And finally, they succeed in this cognitive warfare by deliberately confusing fact and value.
How so?
They take a straightforward, factual reality, Taiwan's de facto independence, its democratic governance for decades, and they successfully reframe it as a moral crime that must be corrected, usually through unification under their terms. By controlling the moral framework of the debate, they shift the entire argument away from a political disagreement between two sides into a battle over loyalty, morality, and historical destiny. They control the words, and by doing so, they attempt to control the entire political trajectory of the island, countering the logic traps and reclaiming the narrative.
Okay, so if we understand this is basically a cognitive battlefield where language is the primary weapon, we need some clear strategies. How can you listening, counter this kind of language terrorism and avoid getting sucked into their narrative framework?
Yeah.
What's the first, maybe most critical move?
Strategy 1 is absolutely crucial. Reclaiming the definition. You must refuse to accept their negative definition of Taiwan independence. The moment you get defensive about the label, the moment you accept it as inherently bad, you've already lost half the battle. You have to flip the script immediately.
Okay, so instead of getting defensive, you turn the conversation towards universal values that are hard to argue against.
That's exactly right. When someone tries to slap that label on you or on a policy, the response should be direct and value-based. Something like, look, if demanding democracy, freedom, and the basic right not to be ruled by an autocracy is what you call Taiwan independence, then frankly, I'm proud of it.
Ah, I see. That immediately shifts the entire conversation. It stops being about a specific territorial dispute, unification versus independence, and it becomes about the core value conflict, democracy versus authoritarianism.
Precisely. And that resonates universally. It puts the authoritarian side on the defensive, forcing them to justify their own system rather than you having to defend your existence. It links Taiwan's struggle to broader democratic struggles everywhere, whether it's Hong Kong, Ukraine, or anywhere else people value freedom.
That's powerful. Okay, what's the next strategy? The analysis mentioned forcing clarity.
Yes, strategy 2, the practical fact check, or forcing clarity. This involves using a kind of rhetorical tactic, almost like a fact-checking live stream in your head, to force politicians, especially from the KMT, to answer specific questions they really can't answer honestly without exposing their deep alignment with Beijing's goals or their own contradictions.
Like that unification question we touched on earlier. Force them to define what they actually mean by unification.
Exactly that. You have to press them relentlessly. Okay, you talk about unification as the goal. Define it. Does that mean A, Taiwan merges into the CCP's People's Republic of China, accepting their one-party political system? Or does it mean B, the CCP somehow merges into the Democratic Republic of China?
And the beauty of that question from a counter-strategy perspective is that both answers are politically toxic for them within Taiwan.
Absolutely lethal. If they admit it's option A, they will be immediately branded, quite fairly, as selling out Taiwan's democracy. If they somehow try to claim it's option B, the mainland becoming democratic under the ROC framework, Beijing will instantly condemn them, proving they aren't actually aligned with Beijing and destroying their pro-China credentials. They thrive on ambiguity. Forcing clarity destroys their political maneuvering room.
And we can use that Putin analogy we discussed earlier as well, right, to force a comparison between their stance and global authoritarian actions.
Yes, definitely. Ask them directly, publicly. What is the fundamental difference between Vladimir Putin annexing eastern Ukraine by force and Xi Jinping attempting to annex Taiwan by force or coercion? Both scenarios involve a larger power trying to seize territory from a smaller neighbor, defying international law and the principle of self-determination. This forces KMT figures to either implicitly defend aggressive authoritarian land grabs or admit the hypocrisy of their whole don't provoke the bully stance.
Okay. Strategy 3 involved exposing double standards.
Strategy 3, exposing the double standard. This is about normalizing Taiwan's actions by simply comparing them to what are considered completely normal, widely accepted behaviors of any sovereign or self-governing nation around the world.
So if they argue, for example, that Taiwan boosting its defense budget is provoking China,
you immediately reply with analogies. Okay. Does Japan maintaining its self-defense forces mean Japan is provoking all its neighbors? Does South Korea's continuing refusal to unify under North Korea's totalitarian regime count as Korean independence that justifies threats? The absurdity of applying these critical labels only to Taiwan becomes immediately clear when you place Taiwan's actions within the context of normal international behavior.
Right. Taiwan is simply trying to do what every other self-governing democracy does, maintain a credible defense and determine its own future free from coercion.
That's the point to drive home. And finally, maybe counterintuitively, strategy 4, the humorous defense. Sometimes you need to break the psychological power, the fear associated with these loaded labels.
How do you do that? Make the accusation itself sound inherently ridiculous.
Exactly. When those heavy terms like traitor or separatist are deployed specifically to induce fear and silence dissent, sometimes the best way to disarm them is with absurdity or humor. Use relatable, colloquial, everyday examples. If someone accuses you, oh, you're just a Taiwan independence supporter, you could maybe reply with something lighthearted but pointed, like, well, if defending my right to vote for my local council member without asking Beijing's permission is Taiwan independence, then I guess every single neighborhood council member here is guilty. Or, even more absurdly, if eating lu roufan, Taiwanese braised pork rice, is considered Taiwan independence, then every night market chef in the country is in big trouble.
Oh, okay, I see. The goal is to strip the word Taidu, that label, of its intended psychological weapon power, turn the sharp knife of cognitive warfare into something dull, maybe even laughable.
So just to kind of synthesize everything we've talked about in this Sip and Talk, the KMT's ideological shift, as documented, represents a really profound political and, you could argue, moral reversal. It appears to be a conscious choice to align their rhetoric, their political style, and even their strategic outlook with those of authoritarian powers like China and Russia.
And that alignment directly risks Taiwan's hard-won security and its democratic health.
Yeah, and thanks to some of the newer, maybe less guarded voices within the party, like Cheng Li-wen, this alignment is no longer particularly subtle or hidden behind diplomatic language. It seems, as the analysis puts it, openly consistent with Beijing's core objectives.
Everything from trying to undermine defense budgets and parroting pro-Russia talking points to actually embracing rhetoric, like praising all process people's democracy, that serves to hollow out democratic norms from within Taiwan itself.
And the profound danger here is that the internal political debate within Taiwan is now, in some ways, actively serving to justify and support the goals of Taiwan's primary external threat. The KMT has, arguably by its own recent choices, become a kind of internal agent, wittingly or unwittingly, in the CCP's broader cognitive warfare campaign against the Taiwanese people and their democratic way of life.
Which leads us to the provocative closing thought we want to leave you, the listener, with today. If a major political party's stated ultimate goal is a peaceful path, but that path seems to necessarily require the gradual abandonment of self-defense capabilities, the adoption of authoritarian-friendly language, and the undermining of faith in democratic institutions, well, how can a democratic electorate rationally justify choosing leaders whose political goals appear fundamentally aligned with those of their primary external threat?
It suggests the true battle for Taiwan's future isn't solely against the CCP's missiles and threats from across the strait, but perhaps also against those forces internally who seem willing to collaborate with the rhetoric of submission, even if they frame it as pragmatism or peace.
A lot to think about there.
Definitely. And just a reminder, as always, we aim to provide objective facts and analysis drawn from the source material we review, purely for discussion and understanding. We're not here to endorse or criticize any specific political party, people, or nation, but simply to advocate for critical, independent thought regarding the information presented.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for this Sip and Talk. If this analysis helped you make sense of this complex and evolving situation, please do hit that subscribe button and maybe share the show with others who might find it interesting.
And don't forget to check out our old buddy Micky's YouTube channel, Micky to Life. He always has some great memes, and I think he just dropped some new travel vlogs, too. Always fun stuff over there.
Definitely check Micky out. Okay, thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you next time.
See you then.